Welcome back to the BERNINA Skillbuilder Sew Along with Sweet Potato Quilts. In this video, we're piecing together block 6, which focuses on square in a square piecing. This block works a little bit differently because it involves bias edges, so I'll share a few tips for keeping everything accurate. Before we jump into the square in a square, I'm starting with a bit of strip piecing, which is a skill we covered in a past block pattern. I will also be using these squares to make 4 at a time flying geese. You can see I've already drawn my diagonal lines across the back of the 4 smaller squares, and I'll sew these up off camera, and when I come back we'll dive right into the square in a square piecing and talk about how to handle those bias edges with confidence. I'm back with all the checkered units finished from strip piecing along with the flying geese I made using the 4 at a time method. Both of these are skills we've practiced in earlier blocks. Now let's focus on the main feature of block 6, the square in a square. For this, I'll start with 1 center square plus 2 of the fabric 3A squares and 2 of the background B squares. The pattern calls for cutting these squares in half diagonally, which creates what we call bias cuts. That means we're cutting against the direction of the weave of the fabric. These edges are naturally more delicate, so before you cut, I recommend giving your fabric a light spray of starch, and as you work with these pieces, handle them gently to prevent fraying, stretching, or distortion on the edges. I'm at my pressing station, and before I cut or piece these fabrics, I'm giving them a good spray of starch. Don't be afraid to really soak the fabric. Some quilters like to wait for it to dry, but it's perfectly fine to press it dry, which is what I'm going to do here. Once it's pressed, you will notice the fabric feels much stiffer. That added firmness gives stability for working with bias edges. And don't worry, after washing, quilting, and snuggling with your quilt, the fabric will go back to its soft, normal texture. And as a general tip, many quilters like to starch all their fabrics before piecing. It provides stability, gets wrinkles out quickly, helps reduce fraying from bias cuts, and leads to more accurate piecing and flatter quilt tops. Now I'm going to stack these 2 squares and cut them diagonally to make 4 triangles. I'll do the same with the other 2. To start building the square in a square, I'll begin with the smaller triangles around the fabric 5 center square. You can only add 2 opposite sides at a time. When you line up the triangles right sides together with one edge of the square, you will notice that the triangle edges are longer than the size of the square, and that is intentional because it will leave room in the corners for your 1/4 inch seam. To make sure everything is centered, I'm going to fold the center square in half and give it a quick crease with the iron, then fold it the other way for a second crease to divide it into quarters. And I'm going to do the same with each triangle, so that when it's time to sew, I will line up the creases so that the triangles sit perfectly centered on the square. I'm going to go ahead and sew along both sides with a 1/4 inch seam, and I'll be back to show you the next step. I'm back, and I've gone ahead and creased all the remaining triangles. I've also sewn 2 of the triangles with a 1/4 inch seam along both sides of the center square. And when it comes to pressing these triangle corners open, I like to avoid using heat at this stage because it will get rid of the creases in the middle of this square. So instead, I'm going to use a seam roller to press them open. This keeps the fabric flat without stretching those delicate bias edges, and you won't get rid of those creases that you will need for your next step of piecing. Once the first 2 triangles are sewn onto opposite sides of the square and pressed open, the next step is to add the remaining 2. Place each triangle right sides together on the 2 other sides, using the creases to line them up evenly. Then sew along each edge with a 1/4 inch seam. I'll get these sewn and come back to show you how it looks when it's all pressed open. I'm back from sewing the remaining 2 sides, and now we have our first square in a square block. At this stage, you can safely press the flaps open with an iron, but since I already have my seam roller handy, I'll use it here too. You will notice a few dog ears sticking out the edges, and I'm going to trim those off while making sure the corner points are still a 1/4 inch away from the edge of my ruler. Then I'll square up the unit and trim it down to 4.5 inches. Next, we're going to keep building the square in a square by adding background fabric triangles to the opposite sides of this unit. Alright, I'm at my BERNINA 770 QE Plus, and I want to show you how I piece at this step at the machine. Instead of folding the square in half to make a center crease, I'm just going to use the crease in the triangle and match it up with the corner of the smaller square unit. Then I'll just slide it into place with right sides together. And when I sew, I want to flip the unit over so that the square unit is on top. That way, I can make sure that as I am sewing, my seam will pass right through the intersection of these seams to create a clean point. I'm lifting my 1/4 inch foot right now with the leg lift, which is one of my favorite features, and I'm going to slide the single triangle layer into position. As I sew along the edge, I'm slowing down to make sure my seam goes directly through that intersection in the center, and if you do the same, you will be able to press it open and see a crisp, accurate point. Check out mine. Here are the first two opposite sides sewn together, and they'll open up to show you nice points. And remember that you can only sew two sides at a time and they're opposite sides. So now I'm left with the remaining two sides to add, and I'll go and get those sewn and be back to show you the next step. I'm back and I'm going to press open the last two flaps. Now this unit needs to be trimmed down to 6.5 inches square, and if everything is lined up correctly, all we will really need to do is trim off the dog ears and give it a quick square up, and just make sure these corners are 1/4 inch away from the edge with your ruler. And there we have it, a finished square in a square unit. I'm going to go ahead and piece the rest of the block, and I'll be back to show you the final layout. And here it is, my finished block for this pattern. It is the square in a square. In this lesson, we also worked with the starch spray and the seam roller, two tools that can really help with accuracy when piecing on the bias. I hope you enjoyed making this block along with me, and thanks for sewing with me today. I'll see you next time.